Americans are generally open to sourcing these products from other countries, just not necessarily countries they see as rivals and competitors. And at present, that includes China. So this is one of the factors I think that's pushing Americans to reconsider exactly how does the US engage with China on trade, and what does that trade mean for national security?
Welcome. I'm Kate Kaup, James B. Duke Professor of Asian Studies, Politics, and International Affairs at Furman University. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I'm pleased today to have an opportunity to talk with Craig Kafura, Assistant Director for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, about the Council's recent survey that examines U.S. public opinion on China. Craig has a long and illustrious bio, but I will let him introduce himself and the interesting work that he's been doing with the Council. Hand it over to you, Craig.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join the National Committee today to talk about public opinion and U.S.-China relations. So the data that I'm going to be presenting today is drawn primarily from the 2023 Chicago Council survey. This is the longest running study of American public opinion on U.S. foreign policy attitudes and dates back to 1974. So we have some very, very long trends to be able to share. This is the flagship research project of the Lester Crown Center at the Council, and I am one of a great team of 4 researchers who study public opinion and U.S. foreign policy pretty broadly. I'll also say that our data is designed to be a public resource. So if you watch this presentation and you have questions about some of the questions we've asked, or if you want to know more, it's all available on our website, including the data sets themselves. So if you'd like to go back to 1974 and look at how Americans thought about foreign policy back then at a very granular level, you can do that, and we'd be happy to help you with it. So the first thing, and that should not necessarily surprise people, is that Americans have turned quite negative on China in recent years. And this is a trend item that we've asked all the way back to 1978, that asks Americans to rate their feelings towards China and other countries on a feeling thermometer scale from 0 to 100. And for most of the last 40 years, Americans hovered somewhere in the mid-40s. Not warm and not cold, just slightly cool. But in recent years, and really since 2018, 2019, attitudes toward China have changed very rapidly and really with a negative tint. Today, Americans rate China a 32 degrees out of 100. That's one of the lowest ratings we've ever recorded for China, only tied with the rating in 2020. And as you can see, Republicans have really, really declined on China, while Democrats are still a little positive. And part of this is the increasing sense that the United States and China are mostly rivals rather than partners. Now, from 2006 up through 2018, Americans were divided on this question. They were not sure whether it was better to characterize those two countries as rivals or partners. But even before the pandemic, by February 2019, more Americans were beginning to view the two countries as rivals. And from that, you see a host of other changes in American policy attitudes. Today, when we ask Americans whether China is an ally or a partner, a rival or a competitor, they're more likely to say that China is a rival or an adversary, rather than a partner. Now, it's not to say that Americans are completely opposed to cooperating with China on any issue, but it does mean that it gives a lot of our questions a bit more of a competitive tint. And of course, one of the main factors I think driving this is the view that China's rise represents a critical threat to the interests of the United States. Today, 58% of Americans, the highest in our data going back to 1990, describe the development of China as a world power as a critical threat to the United States. That includes 71% of Republicans and 52% of Democrats. This is also the first time since 2002 that we've gotten a bipartisan majority of Americans describing China's rise as a threat. At the same time, Americans have very little confidence in China's leader, Xi Jinping, and they have very little confidence in China to deal responsibly with world problems. And I think in this case, a lot of this dates back to the pandemic. Before 2020, in 2018, 2017, and 2015 surveys conducted by the Council, we found that around 4 in 10 Americans said they had at least a fair amount of confidence in China to deal with world problems responsibly. And today that's down to just 19%. And another important factor to consider is that Americans see the gap between China's influence and American influence abroad is narrowing. In 2002, when we asked this question for the first time, Americans believed that the US was far and away the most influential country in the world. But over the last 2 decades, they've seen China slowly narrow that gap. To today, on a 10-point scale, they're only separated by 0.9. That's the closest we've seen in our polling. Now, there's not just one issue that concerns Americans about China, and that's one of the things that makes doing public opinion research on US-China relations particularly interesting. It's not just one factor driving all of the attitudes. And when we ask Americans what their most pressing concern about China is, we don't just get one answer. Instead, people fall across a range of options, including China's economic power, China's communist political system, China's policies on human rights, or China's military power. Now, Democrats tend to be more concerned about China's policies on human rights, and Democrats tend to be more concerned about human rights in general, while Republicans tend to focus more on China's military power or their political system. And again, if you look at other items, Republicans do tend to be more concerned about the military balance of power and more military concerns. But that top one, on economic power, is a really important one to keep in mind. In 2019, we asked whether US-China trade did more to strengthen or weaken US national security. And in 2019, 2/3 of Americans, 64%, said that that trade did more to strengthen US security than weaken it. Just 2 years later, that had switched. Now 58% of Americans said that US-China trade did more to weaken US national security. And that movement happened across party lines, with Republicans and Democrats both becoming more likely to see US-China trade as a negative for security rather than as a positive, as they had before. This is another factor driving some of the concerns around China and driving some of the support for policies that we might touch on later on. In general, as you might have noticed, Republicans tend to be a bit more negative toward China, a bit more concerned about China, and they're also more likely to say that US leaders should focus more on US competition with China. 60% in our most recent survey say that US leaders do not pay enough attention to US competition with China. Democrats are more divided. About 43% say that leaders pay the right amount of attention to China. 36% say not enough. But relatively few think that the US pays too much attention to this issue. And when we ask about specific issues in the US-China relationship, economic competition, human rights policies, surveillance in the United States, most Americans say that the US has not gone far enough in responding to China, rather than saying it has gone too far. Though I will note, for some issues like China's military power or China's territorial claims in Asia, Americans are much more divided, with many Americans saying that the US has been about right in their response. And again, thinking about the differences between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans tend to be much more likely to say the US has not gone far enough, while Democrats are more likely to say the US response has been about right. Now, we did just have an important election, so I do want to also briefly talk about some of the polling the Council has done on American views of Taiwan and the US-Taiwan relationship. Overall, we find that Americans across party lines believe that the US relationship with Taiwan does more to strengthen US national security than it does to weaken it. And among a list of countries in the world, Taiwan falls roughly in the middle of them, with about 2/3 saying it's good for US security. In the event of a crisis around Taiwan, should China invade the island, we find that Americans support aiding Taiwan with nearly all measures short of sending US troops themselves. This means using the military to airlift food and medical supplies, imposing economic and diplomatic sanctions on China, sending additional arms and military supplies to the Taiwanese government. And half of Americans, including 54% of Democrats and 52% of Republicans, say they would favor using the US Navy to break any Chinese blockade around the island. Again, what we don't find support for is sending US troops to the island itself. And in fact, these responses look very similar to an item that we asked the year prior. So we haven't seen a huge movement in attitudes recently, despite increasing concern about potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And also, I would note that these attitudes have not changed substantially, despite some very shifting attitudes on US aid to Ukraine, where otherwise attitudes have been fairly similar. So hopefully this is a good overview of US opinion toward China. There is a lot more to dig into, as I'm sure we'll talk about. And of course, there's always more data to come in future polls.
Great. Thank you very much, Craig, for the wonderful overview. And as you mentioned, it's such a rich study and available online. So I know that our viewers will like to go back and look at the details. Let me just ask a couple of questions. I found some of your slides particularly interesting. One is the shift in attitudes on U.S.-China trade and whether trade is supporting our national security or threatening our national security. And there's a dramatic shift, of course, in American attitudes on that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what you think may be accounting for it, and how the survey supports your findings?
Sure. So I think the timing of those questions will tell you a lot about why that shift occurred. So the first poll was taken in 2019 and the second in 2021. And in between those two polls, you have a huge shock to the global economy and the global trading system, and of course, Americans' everyday lives with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition to all of the other issues that the pandemic unleashed, it also really refocused Americans and policymakers' attention on what globalized supply chains mean in times of crisis. This has also continued, I would note, with the war in Ukraine. This has continued sort of the discussion around what does it mean to have global supply chains in a world where maybe there's more conflict than there was 10 years ago. Now, with respect to China, what you've seen then is Americans thinking about, well, what supplies do we get from China that are necessary for our economy and necessary for our health and safety? One of the issues early in the pandemic was that the US sourced a lot of important personal protective equipment from Chinese suppliers, but those supplies were needed in China. And the Chinese government decided to restrict some of those exports. This created a bit of a crisis. You saw, for example, physicians and nurses in New York wearing trash bags in place of proper PPE during the early stages of the pandemic. Those made for pretty gripping news coverage. And I think that did a lot to shift Americans' attitude on, well, how should we think about supply chains? In other questions that we've asked, we've generally seen that Americans are interested in moving toward more of a friendshoring model. So we'll ask them when it comes to critical supplies or semiconductors, where would you like to source these inputs from? Would you like to source them from any country in order to get the cheapest possible products? Do you want to source them only from friendly countries? Do you want to source them only from the United States? And there are some Americans who would like to only source these things from domestic suppliers, right? Economists will tell you this is going to drive up prices and will not really result in the savings that you're looking for. But Americans are generally open to sourcing these products from other countries, just not necessarily countries they see as rivals and competitors. And at present, that includes China. So this is one of the factors I think that's pushing Americans to reconsider exactly how does the US engage with China on trade and what does that trade mean for national security?
Thank you. And that may be a good segue into the finding that more and more Americans are finding China a rival or an adversary. Only a quarter of Americans in this most recent survey said that they thought that China was a partner that we might need to cooperate with. Can you tell us a little bit about those views? And particularly, of course, there are so many international issues that require bilateral cooperation, things like counter narcotics, climate change, and a whole array of other issues. Do you find Americans, for example, who are very supportive or believe that climate change is our top priority globally, are those Americans more likely to support cooperation with China, or does this concern about China cross all sorts of areas of concern?
It's a good question. And we do see a relationship between how Americans think about some of these other threats in the world and how they think about US-China cooperation. But there is also a third interview there, which is partisanship. So for Americans who care greatly about climate change as a critical US, they certainly support with China on climate change, as do many Americans. However, there are also Americans who do not see climate change as a critical threat, who do not think the government should be spending a lot of time and energy on it. And those Americans tend to be Republicans, tend to have a more negative view of China, and are less interested in cooperating with China on that issue. However, there is one other issue that really does cross the partisan spectrum when it comes to US-China cooperation, and that's arms control. Americans have, for as long as the Council's been polling, Americans have been very concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons internationally and the prospects of nuclear war. In another question, this survey, we asked about critical threats to human existence on the Earth, and nuclear war came up as the most commonly cited existential threat to humanity. And so when we ask about U.S.-China cooperation on arms control treaties, we see bipartisan support because Americans of all partisan stripes are concerned about it, and they think that we can work with China on it. There are some interesting differences, though, on Americans who view China as an adversary. They also tend to be more concerned about military issues and limiting China's global influence, while those who view China as a partner are generally also more inclined to prioritize global issues. That doesn't just include climate change, but also preventing and combating pandemics and also combating world hunger. So there's a bit of a worldview difference between Americans who want to cooperate with China and who see China as a partner, and those who don't and who see China as a rival.
Great, thank you, very interesting. Your survey also revealed very strikingly that more and more Americans, particularly Republicans, but bipartisan, believe that policymakers are not doing enough and that our policy response has not been strong enough in regards to China. Did your survey in any way allow people to suggest what they thought American policymakers should be doing? If they're not doing enough, what would be the next steps that these survey respondents might request?
So in part, we're hoping to follow up on this in the 2024 Chicago Council survey, now that we've identified some areas that Americans want policymakers to do more on. But we have also asked a range of U.S.-China policy questions in the past, and I think that gives us a hint about where Americans want the U.S. government to focus. So there is support for climate change and arms control cooperation, but there's also a lot of support, again, more so among Republicans than Democrats, for policies that are designed to limit exchanges between the U.S. and China. So that means restrictions on trade and investment, restrictions on scientific exchanges, and even restrictions on the number of Chinese students studying in the United States. We've seen majority Republican support for that in past surveys. So I would expect that if we prompt respondents to go in more depth on what kinds of actions they want the U.S. to take, Republicans are generally going to want to restrict those kinds of exchanges. What Democrats want, we'll have to do more polling on.
Thank you. I thought the findings on Taiwan were also very interesting, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that. Findings discovered that a large percentage of Americans think that our relationship with Taiwan strengthens our national security. I wonder if we could start there and assess why they may be feeling this way.
Sure. So I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that although Taiwan policy is a minefield of very specific and important words and phrases and documents, these are not things that everyday Americans think about when they think about Taiwan or U.S. policy in Asia. Americans, their exposure to Taiwan is generally through articles in the media that do not treat Taiwan differently from other countries in the world. Articles about Taiwan's election will simply talk about the election and concerns about China, but they're not going to go into depth about the entire backstory of why Taiwan exists or what its legal status is or the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland or between Taiwan and the United States, etc. And in other surveys that we've done asking about Taiwan, we find that Americans would generally support the U.S. recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. Now, we did not also include the potential consequences, namely a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, so that could be a soft number. I would really love to do an in-depth study of American attitudes just on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So if anyone out there listening has a bucket of money that they're looking to spend on some polling, you know where to find me. We'd love to work with you.
Great. Just one last, that's a good last question for us. If in addition to the Taiwan question, are there other questions that you wish you had covered or that you hope to cover in the next round?
Oh, well, I really want to ask another round of the question about trade and national security, because now we're a few years out from the pandemic. How fresh are those memories? How fresh are those feelings? Has there been movement back on seeing trade as something that binds countries together rather than simply being a source of vulnerability? I really want to get into more depth on US-China bilateral policies, especially on beyond just climate change and arms control. Are there specific actions that the US and China can take that Americans would support to build more confidence in the region? And then I would really like to do more specific items about the US-Taiwan-China relationship. What's the awareness of Americans? How much do they know? And does providing them with additional information change their attitudes? Because one of the ways that they're going to learn that information very quickly is in the event of a crisis. When a crisis occurs, the news coverage will focus a lot on these issues, and Americans will get brought up to speed very quickly. So if we provide that information ahead of time, can we predict perhaps how they would react in a crisis? Would different scenarios and the unfolding of those scenarios result in different public reactions? This would all be really interesting stuff to focus on in 2024, and I'm hoping we get the chance to.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to being briefed on the next one. And I think it is, of course, important for all Americans to learn as much as they can about this important partner or this important player, global player. We don't want to be caught in a crisis. And the National Committee is, of course, committed to educating American and providing a platform for diverse viewpoints on the US-China relationship. Thank you very much, Craig, for joining us today, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you so much for having me.